About 20 years ago, I had the pleasure of attending a conference where John Ortberg, then the founding pastor of the United Methodist Willow Creek megachurch, was the keynote speaker. I was forever changed by that experience. I don't remember exactly where it was or when it was, but I do remember the vivid and empowering message that Ortberg preached about Matthew 14 and leaps of faith. You know the story. Jesus had been taking a break after the feeding of the 5,000, and the disciples were pretty far out from the land in a boat being buffeted. The text reads like this. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Ortberg's sermon about Peter's response to Jesus' invitation invites us to consider the incredible potential that awaits outside of our comfort zone. Out on the risky waters of faith, Jesus is waiting to meet us in ways that will change us forever, deepening our characters and our trust in God. Yeah, the experience is literally terrifying. It's thrilling beyond belief. And it's everything you'd expect of someone worthy to be called Lord. Now, the choice is ours to know him as only a water walker can, aligning ourselves with God's purpose for our lives and for our churches in the process. But here's the thing. The choice has a really big, really hard, almost overwhelming requirement. If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. You've got to get out of the boat and try. You've got to get out of the boat and sink a few times. You've got to get out of the boat if you want to let Jesus pull you back up out of the water. And if you leap, if you take that great big step, if you get out, if you get up and step over the boundaries of what is, if you get out of the institution and head out into the street, if you get out of the box that you know and allow God to direct it all and rescue you when you fall, it will change everything. And you just might find yourself walking on water once in a while. So I'm here to tell you a pretty wild story about following Jesus out of the building into the street to experiment with a new kind of church that uses emerging forms of faith formation, lots of love of neighbor, and justice-oriented community engagement. This experiment, and my friends, it is still an experiment, has energized and empowered this legacy congregation whose story I'm about to tell you, and it has enlightened the neighborhood around it. I'm here to tell you a story about how letting go and letting God, a story about how getting out of what has been and making a commitment to what should be, a story about how being focused on the people who are not now in the church, the postmodern seekers, the SBNRs, the nuns and the duns that are all around you, a story about how that has changed everything. Hashtag get out of the box. Hashtag institution free zone. Hashtag sold the building for Jesus. Hashtag circles of love and care. Hashtag sanctuary UCC. Hashtag church 3.0. Hashtag deep, deep questions. You see, like so many legacy congregations before them, the good people of the Congregational Church of West Medford United Church of Christ, known affectionately by its long-term members as CCWM, had invested decades of hard work and passionate effort, not to mention buckets full of blood, sweat, and tears, trying to grow their church. Like many of you, they were brought up in the modern era and were taught that knowledge was king and that the denomination you belonged to not only defined what you believed, but also gave you your place in society. And like many of you, they had been trying every trick in the Church Growth Consultant's Handbook to get themselves back to that blessed place of privilege where the institution of the Christian church had power in the community and was central to the way of life of everyone in the neighborhood, and in their case, was in an especially prominent position. If only they could get a few more people to visit, they could return to a time when their beautiful stained glass adorned University Gothic 500-seat sanctuary was full of multi-generational families who all kind of looked like each other and never spoke a cross word, where a full-throated, red-robed four-section choir was led by a classically trained musician who played the historic organ beautifully and conducted with aplomb, where their vast, polished, shiny 1950s Sunday school edition was abuzz with the pitter-patter of hundreds of well-behaved children who attended every Sunday, and their youth program and teen dances were considered the place to be on a Saturday night, and the Finn and Hattie dinners put on by the Congregational Women's Group helped to pay the bills and gave everybody a social club to which they might belong. Yes, if only they could get people to come, surely they would see how friendly and fine a fellowship they were, and they would, want what we have and keep coming back. And then they could resurrect those Church 2.0 glory days when it wasn't hard to recruit Sunday school teachers because the moms were available and they considered it their obligation to sign up to serve. And the moderator of the church was a highly regarded local businessman that everyone knew and respected and never questioned. And the well-oiled machine known as the deacons were elected based on their years of membership and took care of everything from the flowers on the altar to visiting the sick and the shut-ins. And the trustees knew how to handle the finances and run a once-a-year stewardship campaign that was always enough to cover the bills because people understood that you were supposed to tithe, and there was a buildings and grounds committee that mowed the lawn at the parsonage and painted the classrooms and upgraded the heating system. If only, indeed. Despite a series of fabulous pastors whose hearts were full of love and whose pulpits were renowned, despite season after season of church growth conferences and direct mail campaigns, despite Bible and book studies on the latest popular solution to spiritual renewal that would lead to church vitality, the good and faithful servants of CCWM numbered only 52 adults and were literally exhausted by all of their efforts and the unspoken grief of not having turned things around. You see, the landscape had changed, and they did not know what else to do. The young, charismatic pastor who had tried to move them forward for the past 4 years gave up and took another gig, and they didn't know if they could manage yet another search process and the transition that would ensue. The annual admonition that their endowment fund would run dry if things did not change really was true this time. They had about 4 or 5 years left at the rate they were spending money on a full-time pastor and their 100-year-old, 25,000 square foot building that had a brand new furnace that had too much oomph for the 100-year-old pipes. I think it was the pipes that kept bursting that finally gave them the courage to face their truth. They called on the denominational support system for help and began to get real about where they were. There's something pretty transformative about facing your death, don't you think? And so they became ready. It was a God thing, of course. No one, especially a 150-year-old institution, gets ready to face death if God is not in the mix. But ready they were to ask the hard questions and really hear about the reality of the changing landscape for the church and their place within it. You know what they say, you can't get to recovery without facing your brokenness, and you can't get to Easter without walking through Good Friday. equipped with a new designated term pastor whose job it was to lead them through this time, and with support from outsiders whose job it was to guide the process, they engaged a curriculum that was designed to get them to a bold decision. Let me say that again. They engaged a curriculum designed to get them to a bold decision, even if that meant closing and giving their resources to someone else to build something new. They decided that they were not going to settle for a move the deck chairs around kind of decision, the kind of decision that change gurus call a technical solution. No, they knew that it was either a slow, self-serving, sloppy stewardship slide into oblivion, or it was to be a leap of faith into a death and resurrection kind of recovery. They committed to themselves and to God to make a bold decision, a change it all if you have to kind of decision, a reframe your perspective so you can face reality kind of decision. They committed to themselves and to God to make the kind of decision you have to make when the ground under your feet has shifted and everything that you have done in the past doesn't work anymore and you don't know what to try next. So you start to experiment in order to find an adaptive solution to that earthquake. They chose a path that would not let them off the proverbial theological hook. The process required that they answer 3 simple yet profound and not always easy to answer questions. 1, who are we and what do we stand for? 2, what is it that God is calling us to be and do? And 3, who and where is the neighbor that needs us, that needs what we are and what we stand for? For what it's worth, they did not choose a pastor who was going to let them off the ecclesiological hook either. You see, they chose me, and I knew something about the changing landscape of being the Christian church in this time and place. So I helped them to consider what form their bold decision might take. Out of their faith, and the belief that even though they did not know what to do or exactly what it was that God wanted from them or for them, there was still more light to be shed on the Congregational Church of West Medford, and they believed that they had a call to continue to be the church. And so they agreed that they would get out of the boat and try. And even if they failed, which they understood was a distinct possibility, the experience of leaping and the outcomes of the experiment would be worth the effort. They understood as they stepped out that at the least, lessons would be learned and God would walk alongside of them. They developed a core list of values and then they crafted a picture, a vision of what it would look like if they could make those core values a reality in their city. You see, if you want to make things change, if you want to make change happen, if you're going to make it through the tension and the effort of changing everything, it had better be about your values, because that's what will energize your actions and power you through. That is what will drive you out of the box. So these beautiful folk envisioned themselves not as members of an institution, but as disciples, as Great Commandment and Great Commission people. They envisioned themselves as Jesus followers who love God and their neighbor, who go out and make disciples, baptize them, and teach them the Jesus way. They understood themselves to be theologically and socially progressive followers, which meant that everything that they do is experiential and experimental, heartfelt and interactive. They would invite questions and allow folk to discover their own faith. They would take action for mission and justice and preach an open and affirming message that seeks racial, economic, LGBTQIA, and other forms of justice for the oppressed. Their work would be committed to community, connection, collaboration, and partnerships, and no matter what, they would meet people where they were. Worship would be grounded in their Christian tradition and history and faith, while they committed to exploring what was being called forth for today's seeker of spirituality. They would find ways to merge the old and new and multi-faith spiritual practices. And finally, they would prioritize those who are not yet here and resistant to church, including the SBNRs and the nuns and the duns. From these values and vision, they wrote a compelling purpose statement, and they started to imagine what forms their ministry might take in order to live into this vision. They wanted to get out of the boat and be the church, and somehow, well, by the grace of God, of course, they found the courage and the fortitude to sell that beloved property and use those resources to be the church. Not to have the church or even do the church, but to be the church. There are a whole lot of structural details that would bore you to tears, but they wrote a new set of bylaws that cleared the way for a new name, a new space, a new brand, and a new way of being that was all about serving and not about membership. They got out. 5 years ago, they left the dark, heavy, disempowering, empty sanctuary of CCWM, and they literally walked down the street carrying a few precious mementos with them to a light-filled, airy, freshly renovated, energized art gallery storefront where a champagne brunch and Holy Communion awaited them, and they began anew as Sanctuary United Church of Christ. Those values I talked about have driven everything, and honestly, it has been the hardest thing that we have ever done. We work really hard and we try things, and some of them work and some of them fail. We've had some big fights about stuff because transforming everything is really hard and there's disagreement no matter what. But let me finish by sharing a few of the ways that I think we have walked on water. Getting out and focusing on the folk who are not with us has meant 3 really important things. There are new forms of faith formation and worship. We are curating opportunities for meaning and purpose. And there's spiritual and moral leadership in the city out beyond the walls of the church in the city square. So here are a few of the ways that this is starting to work. We're experimenting with and discovering emerging forms of worship and faith formation that meet people where they are, that are connected to popular culture, and that offer the kind of experiences that feed postmoderns who are suspicious of institutions, expect to participate in what they do and have their voice be valued, and want to make a difference, or they won't come back. So we've leaned into art and film as one form for faith formation. Once a month, we screen a dramatic film, have a discussion about themes of humanity and faith. Every month, our space is filled with a new artist's work that inspires conversation in our monthly art church worship service. We literally consider scripture through the art in the room. Everything that we do is collaborative. Worship takes place in a circle and allows for all voices to be heard, whether it's art church, breakfast church, messy church with parents and kids. The gathered community is the liturgy. Out of our experiences over the past 5 years, we've come to understand that our greatest gift is that we're very good at asking deep questions, having deep conversations, making deep connections, developing deep convictions, and sharing deep commitments. That has become the container and the form for what has emerged for Sanctuary's spiritual practices. Secondly, we're invested in spreading lots and lots of love of neighbor by curating opportunities for people to find meaning and purpose through service. We took a classic church ministry, visitation, and spiritual care and turned it outward. So instead of organizing a circles of care ministry on members, we're sending people out to care for people in need who are not from our church. In the same way, we're seeking and curating other opportunities for service, like a monthly meal at a homeless shelter and making sandwiches for the outdoor church in Cambridge, and building and filling micro food pantries, which are popping up all around the city because of our leadership. We recruit folk via social media to join us, and we get them to sign up using a text to volunteer tool, and that network has begun to blossom and grow. Once a year, we curate a week-long youth community service camp called AM to PM, where we find the service projects, recruit teens from the high school, supervise, feed, and transport them, and provide them with 40 hours of their community service requirement. While doing so, we teach them about the systemic challenges to overcome homelessness and hunger and challenges to our creation. Of course, in all of these things, we share the other things that we're doing, and we've begun to experience regular cross engagement. People are signing up to serve and then attending a faith and film and then asking for a pastoral conversation and finally attending breakfast church because they have a relationship with us. Finally, we've invested heavily in justice-oriented moral leadership and outward-facing community engagement, which has given us a seat at the table of much of what is happening in our community. We bring a tent and volunteers to every community day and arts festival that takes place, sharing our story and inviting people to share in our grace. We provide sponsorship and serve as the fiduciary organization to community groups whose work is aligned with our values, such as Medford Overcoming Addiction and the Medford Arts and Culture organizations. We've founded or taken leadership in the community and school-based organizations such as Medford Conversations Project, Safe Medford, Medford Health Matters, the Gay Straight Alliance, and the Center for Citizenship and Social Responsibility at the high school. And perhaps most importantly, we take a public stand on matters of faith and justice. Our progressive, faith-based voice, those values that have shaped what we do, are expressed at the Chamber of Commerce and at City Hall, in the school system and in community conversations, and even in the city square when we're protesting and being a voice for justice. Not only is this empowering for us to have taken back the place of faith in the city square, but it's had a huge impact on our visibility. People know what we stand for and they're attracted to it. People know that we're that kind of Christian and they're less afraid. So in closing, I offer this vision of hope. This past year, the efforts and angst borne by a small and fatigued group of church leaders who had been trying to keep it all going for 30 years was rewarded by the election to our board, which we call the Leadership Circle, of a slate made up entirely of folk who had not made that walk down the street from the building that had been sold. None of those members of our board hold a memory of that grief, and all of them were attracted to this experiment, this new kind of church. Each of them came to be sanctuary for different reasons. One because of the art, another because of our recovery commitment, another who wanted the authenticity and spirituality of what happens in our worship circles, another an openly gay, formerly Catholic man who just couldn't imagine himself anywhere else, and another a lesbian who can't yet take communion as a former Catholic, but who wants what we care about to become a reality. There are even several clergy who you might say are done with church as they had served it, 2 retired and 2 extra parochial clergy who love the freewheeling out of the boat way that we are being sanctuary. And so the experiment continues. It's been 5 years. We're completely blessed, and we pray that God has more mercy and more work for Sanctuary United Church of Christ. May it be so.